For Global Business Update, Michael Wilson joins us now from Cape Town, South Africa. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning. Let's start with the Asia-Pacific markets. And given those big falls on Wall Street last night, fairly mixed actually this morning, not moving an enormous amount. However, I do need to draw your attention to this, that the president of China, Xi Jinping, has warned that the Lunar New Year, which sees the biggest global migration of families, 1.4 billion people, 2 billion trips within China, may act as a super spreader for COVID-19. So given the big lockdown in China and all the rest of it, and given the fact that it appears as though infections are rising, the Lunar New Year celebrations, which begin fairly soon, could be a huge add to the COVID situation in China, could be a big test of it. So he is warning about that. It could be what's described as the biggest super spreader event since the whole thing started in Wuhan in 2019. In Zurich, as a sort of throw-off from Davos, being as how they're both in the same country, the Vice President of China, Liu He, met Janet Yellen yesterday. The first face-to-face talks, these took place in Zurich. He talked about tech. The US apparently didn't. We're not exactly sure what took place there, but any face-to-face meetings are seen as a good prospect for trade between the two. Remember that in October, the United States took a sweeping ban on any kind of business or business people actually working with high-end semiconductors, either China-based or owned by China, and President Joe Biden has not repealed any of the Trump-era China tariffs. So that looks like a relatively positive thought. As far as the United States is concerned and the markets there are concerned, as I said, the Dow Jones fell 600 points yesterday. There is some profit taking and also some disappointing retail sales, and the PPI fell 0.5% in December. So all those kind of things, and also add to that, of course, the Empire State Manufacturing Survey, all of which pointed towards a slowing economy, and that really was pushing stocks down yesterday. Now, we reported, did we not, that Microsoft was beginning to lay off people? Well, the news is they're going to lay off 10,000 people. They're joining Amazon, Alphabet, and Meta. But one company that is not, and is therefore getting a lot of investor attention, is Apple. And the reason that Apple's not doing that is because it didn't necessarily extend as rapidly in terms of hiring as the other countries did. If you look at the rates of hiring, Apple is about the lowest of them, and Amazon has one and doesn't have a load of employees. Amazon has 1.8 million employees. Anyway, so Apple is the one thing that investors are looking at which is not subject to layoffs right now. Adding to the investor story, and it appears that investors hold, and these are figures, about $4.8 trillion worth of cash. That beats what they were holding in May 2020, which is the last high, 4.79 trillion. Now, the question is, where will that cash go? Will it head towards the stock market? Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. People are getting quite good returns from the money markets right now. And also, they're not liking the kind of volatility that they're seeing in the stock market. So that's a mystery. But that wall of money is there, depending on how it's actually distributed around the various financial instruments on Wall Street and, of course, in the rest of the world as well. I should note there's no specific economic or business angle to this, but Jacinta Ardern has stood down as the Prime Minister in New Zealand. She was socially progressive, obviously heading the Labour Party, and took a very, very hard line attitude towards pandemic response. Basically, the country shut its borders, and she has got nothing. She says she's got nothing left in the tank, so she's going to resign. The the elections are in October, it isn't necessarily certain that the Labour Party would actually win those. But anyway, just thought we'd note that because she is a position of influence. And I suppose the one business connection might be if it throws any light on the Asia-Pacific balance of trade power. I suspect not, but we'll see. Right, to the EU then, and France. Strikes throughout the country today, protesting about the rise in the retirement age that Macron wants to push through from 62 to 64. Trains, pension schemes, schools, anything to do with public work, they have to, and people will have to work 43 years for a full pension. 68% of the public oppose these increases. That's what was being said. So there are mass strikes throughout France today. As far as the UK is concerned, the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, talking in Davos, has been saying that under a Labour government, Britain would be open for business. This discussion of whether socialism is a good idea has actually been going on in the UK since the 1950s, and there was a slight change when Tony Blair took power, but not exactly sure what clothes Sir Keir Starmer is actually wearing as we speak, but he's also promised a boost for investment and also a boost for green investment in the UK as well. And just a brief note, yesterday we saw a fall in the inflation figures in the UK. I suspect there is still considerable headwinds, but nevertheless the pound has risen against the dollar as a result of that. Oil, the figures there suggest that if there is going to be a soft landing in the United States, and there may well be, given those relatively benign inflation figures and the PPI figures yesterday, the Fed is expected now to be raising rates by 0.25% when it meets on February the 1st. But again, the short-term demand for oil, the short-term demand for crude is still very, very volatile indeed. BHP, the commodities company, is saying that China, when it actually emerges from its lockdown, will stabilize the price of commodities, and it's joining Rio Tinto in that, expecting the commodities sector to stabilize and maybe increase as well. But it's all about China and when it actually gets back to pre-pandemic levels. And cryptos, well, the latest one to file for bankruptcy is Genesis. Bitcoin is down 2.51% as a result of that. And the authorities are gradually turning the screw on other companies as well. And, you take your pick, there's one called Bizlato, which is owned by a Russian national who lives in China. Again, the authorities are taking a very, very sharp line as far as some of these crypto exchanges are concerned. Is it to say that this is the end of crypto? I don't believe it is. I've often said this. I think once these sort of teething problems have died down, then I think we'll see it as a major force. Certainly the blockchain way of paying people. That's the global view this morning.
Michael, and then I will ask, the questions. The first on crypto. There's also the story about Bizlatos, which is managed by a Russian who lives in China.
It's mentioned that one, didn't it? It's Bizlato, that's right.
Yeah.
Anatoly Legkodimov.
Anatoly, yes, whose cryptocurrency exchange has been identified as providing service for criminals and crooks and drug barons. And he has been charged by the United States authorities. That crypto exchange has also been seized. But I like your optimism that all of these problems within the crypto exchange sector is not likely to lead to the end of that particular emergent industry. As for Jacinta Ardern, well, I think all we can have for her is commendation. She says she's tired. There's no more oil in the tank for her to be able to go ahead. But in the 5.5 years that she was Prime Minister in New Zealand, she did very well. And the Jacinta mania, went beyond the territory of New Zealand Maybe because of her youth and also because of the kind of leadership that she provided during the COVID pandemic at the height of it. She was one of those women that we continue to celebrate, particularly on this program, as forward-looking, as providing reasonable leadership. Well, she steps down on February 7, as leader of the party. The elections in October, maybe, Jacinta mania will help to restore the fortunes of the Labour Party that didn't particularly do well in the last elections in New Zealand. But we wish her well. She says politicians are human. And that, I think, is a very strong message. She wants to go and get married to her partner, and she wants to look after her daughter. Anyway, that's about Jacinta Mania, someone that is admired beyond New Zealand. But I was going to ask you, one of the things coming out of Davos is this concern about the dollar sliding because retail sales going down, data that came out from the U.S. in December, and concerns that the Feds may not go beyond 0.25%. The Fed will be meeting February 1. How can anybody be so sure, that there will be further decrease, even to the point of 0.25 percentage points? Because all of that is just based on calculations that the Feds will not do that. Now, you mentioned Liu He, the Vice Premier of China, inviting Janet Yellen. But if you look at the readout from China and the one from the Department of Commerce in the U.S., the two of them are saying two different things about the meeting. So can anybody put so much store about this promise that communication lines will be open when there are unresolved issues about tariffs, unresolved issues about semiconductors, unresolved issues about the rivalry between both countries?
I think it's a question of how good is your Mandarin, basically. I mean, I agree with you. Yes, there were two very conflicting reports. The US said that the Chinese said they spoke tech. The US didn't, and I did point out that those bans and those export reductions are still in place. Still, the Trump. The Trump rules are still in place, and Joe Biden has done nothing to alter that at all. So I feel as though it was one of those kind of things. It's important that they sat face to face. Let's hope they sit face to face again in the near future. But as anything coming out of that, I'm as mystified as you are. I saw that the two, and they are very, very conflicting ideas of what was actually said. And I think this is the way that trade negotiations coming out of the cold will probably go forward. But he is very experienced as far as trade negotiations are concerned, and he's also head of the financial stability department of his particular administration in China. So I feel as though she is talking to the right person. Whether or not she's making the right kind of noises, I simply don't know. I join you in congratulating Jacinta Ardern. A lot of people in New Zealand do not, and it's no certainty that the Labour Party will actually win the elections in October. But yes, I applaud her honesty by saying enough's enough. I've run out of ideas. I've got nothing left in the tank. I really need to get back to my life. You have to applaud that kind of honesty, don't you?
Absolutely, you have to, and she'll definitely remain on record as at the time the youngest female world leader at the age of 37 when she was elected, and definitely one for the record books. Well, let's talk about Emmanuel Macron, another young leader in France, whose pension reforms not popular, and today unions proceed on strikes. Some are wondering, some analysts are observing to read the body language of the people to see if President Emmanuel Macron would retreat on his pension reforms. What's your take on this?
I think if he does retreat on it, and he may well, it says a great deal about his power, and it says a great deal about France as well. Most other countries do not have such a low retirement age, and I feel as though this is absolutely fundamental to France. It is not affordable, that's pretty clear, because the population is getting older, and therefore there are more people to support. This is a fact of life, and unfortunately France has gone on too long believing that there is as much right not to work as there is to work. And I think it is basically a socialist country. Now, again, I like traveling there. I like the fact that when I go to the local authority, the mairie, there are lots of things to do, lots of art lessons to take, lots of music lessons to take, all those kind of things. But that's all because the country, after the various revolutions, has been run for the benefit of the people. Now, that's fine, but I feel as though this is going to be absolutely crucial. And many people will be looking at this, and if he is forced to stand down, then a lot of doubts will be brought to the surface about whether or not the rest of France can be brought to reform. In other words, long lunch hours, more than an hour, working at weekends, all these kind of things that are an irritant for the rest of the world as it moves on to 24/7 doesn't take place in France. So basically, if the workers win, it will be Macron's loss.
Well, thank you very much, Michael Wilson, for giving us the global business update for today. Communications Group, MTN, says it doesn't owe any taxes to the Ghanaian government, despite being hit with a charge of $773 million. The firm's CEO spoke to Arise business correspondent Rutus Odiri at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. He began by asking if the telecommunications sector is recession-proof.
The discussion here at Davos around recessions is that actually for developed markets, maybe the prospects for 2023 will be better than we thought of, maybe 2 or 3 months ago. It looks like in some countries it will be either very shallow recessions or actually recessions will be avoided completely. However, in the markets we operate in, Africa, I think it will be a bit more challenging. There's still going to be some socio-economic and challenges coming out of the crises that we've come out of. COVID, firstly the pandemic, then we had the war in Ukraine, and you have heightened inflation in many markets. So I think we're going to find that in the markets we operate as MTN, things will be challenging. Having said that, I think the telecommunications sector should have a lot more resilience. The services that we offer, these are in demand. People need to get connected. 1 out of 2 Africans still doesn't have a smartphone. So the job to connect people, I think, is going to be, continuing to accelerate. So it's not that we are recession-proof. I think we will have, in general, a much more resilient performance in a macro that is still going to be challenging across the African markets.
What is going on with governments around the world that are strapped for cash, trying to hit MTN up for money? I'm talking about the Ghanaian government that we all know has a revenue and debt problem, coming out of nowhere with a $773 million back tax bill for MTN Ghana. What is your stance on that? Are you responding to them?
Look, I think we must separate the issues. There's 2 issues, and I think I touched it on the first question, really around that, given the polycrises that we're facing globally, our African markets are going to get hit, and the pain will be felt more severely in Africa than anywhere else, I would argue. So, you're talking about Ghana, but I think it's not just Ghana, it's many markets. Egypt is facing the challenges, Ethiopia, Zambia, Ghana, and the list could go on. So I think we must first recognize that there's a big issue where the African continent has to think about how does it get out of this challenge. And I would argue that the Africans must figure it out for themselves, business, government, and broader society. So Ghana is caught up in all of this, as many other countries are. I think the second question you're raising really is about MTN, and with respect to the, the tax assessment that we've, that's been, we've our communication, which we released last Friday, as well as an investor call on this Monday past, is that, firstly, for us, taxes due had been paid, and we stand by that position. We are going to constructively engage the authorities in Ghana on this, and we are seeking, we hope that we can find a resolution to the matter. But we are quite resolute that we believe the taxes due were paid. We're holding no provision, no contingent liability. That's how strongly we feel. There's an independent report, and the reports that would stand and substantiate our position. But it's an ongoing matter, but we look forward to constructively engaging with the authorities in Ghana over the next 2 to 3 weeks.
The internet service provider space is really heating up, and I want to get your thoughts on Elon Musk's Starlink that is making inroads in Nigeria. Are you nervous? How are you responding to that?
No, we're not nervous as MTN Group or MTN Nigeria. I mean, we think that over the medium to long term, you are going to have connectivity anchored by three forms of technology. Subsea cables that I think that will give us the connectivity across markets and continents. You're going to continue to see investments there. Terrestrial networks like ours, wireless carriers, as well as fixed networks on the ground. I think you're going to see investment. And you're going to continue to see investments in low Earth orbit satellites such as Starlink, there are others, OneWeb, and others that I think you're going to find continuously coming. So the way we see it is that this is a complementary technology. 5 to 10 years out, wherever we are in the world, we're always going to be online. You're never going to be, going out, deep into Kaduna State in Nigeria and say, I've got no connectivity. Because if your terrestrial network is not working, your device will automatically attach to satellite. That world is coming. So the way we see this is that it's complementary. The average African, cannot afford the price points that Starlink is offering at the moment. We understand the technology will improve and the cost curves will come down. But from our position that optical fiber transmission is going to be superior to satellite for a long time. But what satellite has is that it can get to the deep rural areas and where the network is shut down because of power shortages. You will have power in space. So I think that the key thing is it's going to be a complementary technology, and you're going to see us, terrestrial networks such as ours, partnering, with space operators over time.
We understand that MTN is working with a company that helps people with disabilities in South Africa called Convo. Can you tell us more about the pilot project that the two of you are working on?
No, look, we're always looking at figuring out through technology how do we enable and give people better lives. Disabled people, have constraints that limit their ability to live as full a life as others, abled people would. So what we are looking at there is to figure out, how do we use the technology to basically improve their lives and create opportunities for themselves to build their own businesses. That's where we are focusing our technology. But I think you'll hear more of that over time. It's something that we're pretty excited about.
Finally, I just want to get your outlook, I guess, on the telecommunications sector in 2023. How do you see things playing out, I guess, globally, Africa in total?
Yeah, I remain pretty excited about the telecommunications sector. There is still, particularly in Africa, a massive job to do to drive digital inclusion. As I said, basically 1 out of 2 Africans doesn't have a smartphone. And as long as they don't have a smartphone, they don't have access to the internet and the benefits of the internet. So we, are pretty bullish about, the sector going into 2023. We understand that the macro will be very challenging for many of our consumers and the markets that we operate in. But we can bring, 2 nation states the digital infrastructure that can help Africa leapfrog some of the challenges. We're going to be putting $2 billion of capex into our networks across the various markets we're operating. We're sustaining our level of capex because we really believe in the opportunity. 1/3 of that will be going to Nigeria specifically. I mean, we're very excited about Nigeria and the growth prospects there. Mobile money are growing off our communications business. So we remain bullish about the telco sector, and that we should be able to see very good growth and new customers coming on to our networks for the very first time. We remain excited.
Rotus there with Ralph Mopita, Group CEO and President MTN. Rotus getting some great interviews at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Well, the annual summit in Davos attracts business leaders and policymakers from around the world. Arise business correspondent Rotus Odiri spoke to the governor of the Reserve Bank of South Africa, Lesedia Kyangiago, and began by asking if he believes there will be a global recession in 2023 and whether South Africa could be vulnerable.
South Africa is a small open economy. We are integrated into the global economic system. We are a major exporter of commodities. The question that would come is, if a recession sets in, what does it mean for commodity prices? What does the opening up of China mean for global growth? What does it mean for inflation, and what does it mean for commodity prices? Those are the big questions that we are going to have to grapple with. South Africa faces its own risks, and those risks have to do with our long-standing structural constraints, and add to that the fact that inflation has been rising globally, and in South Africa it had also been rising. On the domestic front, we started early to adjust policy to deal with inflation. On the global side, the developed economies moved a little bit late.
Is monetary policy enough to bring inflation down in South Africa, for instance?
Monetary policy is what has to be implemented to deal with inflation, irrespective of whether that inflation is coming from overseas or is coming from the domestic sources. The way in which we deal with it is that we look at the external shocks to the inflation outlook, and then ask ourselves the question, are these shocks temporary? If they are temporary, we do nothing. If the shocks are lasting or they lead to second round effects in the domestic price formation, then we are forced to act. And so we were not sure when we started in 2021 to tighten policy. We were moving gradually, and then we saw evidence that the prices are starting to spread beyond just the energy shock and the food price shock, and that they are starting to spread to other prices. And in that instance, then monetary policy has got to act.
Okay, so year-on-year inflation, we saw it come down from 7.4% in November to actually from 7.6% in October to 7.4% in November. So would you say that your monetary tightening has been working?
Too early to tell. If you see what is happening, this would be in respect of the actions that were taken at least 12 months ago, not the most recent ones, because monetary policy works with a lag. The reading that we saw yesterday had just confirmed that 7.8 that we saw 5 months ago was definitely the peak, and now we have seen 4 consecutive months of a decline in inflation. The only problem is when this inflation went up, it went up like a rocket. And when it is coming down, it's like it's on a very slow-moving escalator. What is important is the trend. And for us as the central bank, we would like to see that inflation declining towards the midpoint of the inflation target range. And that is what would give us comfort that it would protect the incomes of the poor.
Okay, and final question for you, Governor. What is your outlook for the South African economy for the year 2023?
The outlook for 2023 is going to be very challenging. What we have seen over the past 3 years have been the shocks that the South African economy had been exposed to, whether it had been load shedding, whether it had been COVID, whether it had been the floods, that the South African economy has demonstrated incredible resilience. And last year, so many of the quarters on the growth front surprised on the upside. And I'm not surprised that some of the market commentators actually believe that 2022 GDP outcome could be better than what the central bank has done. Said. But that is in the past. The challenge is going to be 2023, and it's anybody's call.
Well, Rochus Udiri there, Arise News correspondent, reporting from the World Economic Forum in Paris.